So I'm going to start, and I hope everyone can see Elizabeth's screen. She's kindly sharing the slides for us this afternoon. So we really wanted to talk with you this afternoon about communicating with children about illness and death during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we wanted to start with the voice of a child, just talking about some of her experiences in the pandemic.
Sorry. Oh.
I know that coronavirus means that I can't go to school and I can't play with my friends. I know it means I can't see my grandma and everyone has to wash their hands all the time. I know it makes people really sick and lots of people have died. But I don't understand why my brother is so grumpy, even though he normally hates school, and why my mum and dad are arguing, even though they think I can't hear them.
Thank you. So I guess that piece illustrates really, really nicely that although children understand an awful lot about the practical implications of corona, they're very familiar with social distancing, they're very familiar with the importance of hand washing. What's much less clear to children is about the wider emotional impact on their family and how this is affecting the members of their family in terms of their behaviour. Of course, at the moment, our conversations are very much dominated by the pandemic. The media is saturated with news of hospitalisations, death toll, restrictions, lockdown, and probably every social conversation that we're having at the moment starts with kind of, how are you guys surviving at the moment? Children have had access, I think, to a lot of very good quality information that's being designed specifically with children in mind, thinking about trying to understand social distancing, about the importance of hand washing, how the virus is transmitted. But I think crucially, not only are children getting this information, they're also getting exposed to high levels of parents' stress and anxiety, both about the risk of illness and concern for other members of the family, but also as adults, we're also thinking perhaps slightly longer term as well in terms of the economic and social implications for our future. So children are being exposed to both of those at the same time that the familiarity of their routine and activities has been completely disrupted. For many children, there's no school at all, or there's e-learning. They've got very, very limited contact with their peers, and clubs and activities, if they're still existing, look very, very different in terms of doing activities on Zoom or Teams, and the use of screens, which children are much less familiar with as a way of interacting with other people. And this is just so, so important, because it's usually these kinds of activities that offer children kind of that refuge of familiarity. In the past, when perhaps time was experienced a bereavement, children were able to go to school, there was an air of normality, there were other adults around them who could pick things up and help them manage those emotionally challenging situations. But all of that has really been completely disrupted at the moment. And that is so important in terms of thinking about children's longer term mental health and resilience. Children are incredibly astute observers of the environment around them. And as parents, we would do anything to protect our children from distress. But children notice when something's happened in the family. They notice that phone calls are suddenly being taken behind closed doors. They notice that particular words are being said in whispers. They notice changes in adults' mood, or in changes in the rules in the household, or when someone is suddenly unexpectedly absent. And children need explanations for what they observe, because when they're not told about what's happening, then children start to draw their own conclusions, which can be more dire than the truth. Sophie Ratcliffe, in her book, The Lost Properties of Love, writes very, very powerfully about her experience as a child, sleeping for many years on the landing outside her parents' bedroom. She knew that there was some threat and of harm to her family, and assumed that this must be burglars, whereas in fact the threat was actually the secret that her father had cancer. So children's understanding evolves with their development and through childhood and adolescence. So when we're communicating with children, we really need to be aware of their understanding and tailor information accordingly. And if you could go on to the next slide, Elizabeth, we'll talk a little bit more about what this might be. I think it's really important to think first of all about, when we talk about children, people often think about children when they're perhaps at school age, but actually even infants will notice subtle changes in the responsiveness of their caregivers. So even young babies are not immune to the consequences of COVID. Under twos will absolutely notice the absence of a familiar caregiver, start searching for them, seeking their return. By the age of 3 or 4, children understand that death is part of life. But perhaps what they don't understand is the irreversibility of death. So when someone has died, it is really important to keep repeating that key message that the dead person will not and cannot return. Then thinking about children who are a little bit older, between the ages of kind of 5, children have more of an understanding about what might cause an illness. But this coincides with the development of their own sense of conscience, so responsibility for things, but also a phase that we call magical thinking. And this is when children are able to make a link between unrelated thoughts or actions and something else happening. So I'll never forget the story of a boy whose mother had HIV. And one morning he was refusing to go to school, even though he knew it would cause his mother to miss her clinic appointment at the hospital. Many years later, after his mother had sadly died, the boy confessed that he'd always blamed himself. "It's my fault," he said. "I was naughty that day, so I'm responsible for her death." So we need to think very, very clearly and very openly with children about what they're understanding about what they're seeing, and potentially those links that they're making between events that as adults we see as completely unrelated, but we need to understand how children are constructing their own sense of what's happening within the family. And then moving on to adolescence, again at that stage we would say that children or young people have a more mature and comprehensive understanding of illness and death. But actually some of the normal tasks of adolescence are around achieving independence and autonomy. To separate from their family are significantly disrupted when either themselves or a family member becomes unwell. And we only have to think of the current social distancing rules and how this is completely contrary to adolescents' need to be with their friends and to seek that independence from their families. So next slide, thank you, Elizabeth. So in 2019, our group at the University of Oxford published 2 invited reviews, synthesising the global evidence about communicating with children. The first paper was about children's own life-threatening condition, and the second paper was about a life-threatening condition in their parents. And the key conclusion from these papers was that the effectiveness of communication with children has long-term implications for not only their own psychological well-being, but also the psychological functioning of their family, and also for the healthcare professionals who are tasked with communicating with children and families about these issues. And the papers concluded with a series of guidelines which we developed through an expert group of international researchers to support healthcare professionals prepare and structure these conversations with children, young people and their families about life-threatening conditions. And now Elizabeth's going to pick up on how this is applicable to COVID-19.
I just have to apologise now. I've got quite a few children in my house that keep running in and out of the room, so I apologise now for any interruptions. I have told them countless times. Anyway, so what can we do? So as Louise described, what can we do as adults? And when we talk about adults, we mean every adult. Some of us are parents, some of us are grandparents, some of us are neither. But actually this is so important, and it goes across all sectors and all disciplines when we're talking about how we can support children. So obviously our expertise is how we communicate. So I'm just going to go through ways that we know will help children, and then a bit of primary evidence of why we know this is important. So it's all about asking and listening to children about what they understand. And obviously, because of the reason why we've been asked to talk today, it's about the language that you use. So it has to be concrete and it has to be specific. Children take things on completely face value. And we're talking about from very young children, as Louise has described, to adolescents. So when we talk about someone being ill or unfortunately even dying, euphemisms just create confusion. For example, if you say, oh, today we lost Uncle Barry, actually maybe Uncle Barry, if we look hard enough, we'll be able to find them again. So it's about providing that concrete information that means they can't get confused. And when you're talking to children about illness or corona of course this is what today is about, it's about being authentic about your feelings. This is awful for all of us. None of us really know what's going to happen. And as Louise described, if you as a parent or as an adult are talking behind closed doors and getting stressed, or they can hear raised voices about money issues or whether we know what the future is going to be like for any of us, children hear those and they pick up on everything we're doing and we're saying. So what we have to do is provide a model for our children. So we say, I frequently say to my 6-year-old and my 3-year-old, this is hard for mummy, I have to work today even, and I've got to do a Skype call, and this is difficult. And so it's difficult for you as well, but that's okay. And it's all about normalizing those emotions and those behavioral reactions to this pandemic. I sometimes get very stressed and very cross, and so do my children, and we talk about that as a family. But as a parent, or like I said, another adult, whether that be a teacher or another healthcare professional, it's understanding that actually maybe some of those reactions or behavioural things that children are doing is because of a consequence of this misunderstanding and confusion, or just anxiety about what's going on. So we always have to be positive, reassuring, using that language that says, you know, this is difficult, but together as a family, or together as a teacher and a child, this will be okay, and we'll muddle through it together, but everything will be okay. And to encourage those kind of coping behaviours, like, I know this is really frustrating now, but shall we do some drawing or some reading together, or trying to help them through this process. And just opening that line of communication just allows you then, as that adult, to support the children with their worries, fears, or anything that they're going through. So Louise and I wrote about this recently as a comment in the Lancet Child and Adolescent Health, and with our collaborators in Blackpool Better Start, which is a large project that's ongoing at the moment, which is funded by the National Lottery, we actually used the things that I've just gone through and made a really lovely video on tips about how to talk to your child about coronavirus. And as Louise mentioned at the beginning, we're not talking about washing hands and social distancing. There's been beautiful stuff made by all of you guys, and you know, there's lots out there about children understanding what coronavirus is, but actually, again, that emotional authenticity. So this video is very much for under 5s, because it's a real passionate thing of Louise and I, that people often assume that little kids don't really know what's going on, or you know, they'll be fine, they know that coronavirus and, you know, things are changing, but they'll be all right. But actually they don't, and they need that emotional authenticity with with adults and parents and grandparents especially. So we made this really lovely video, which is of course free to share with Blackpool Better Start. So as Louise mentioned, we were commissioned to do a review for the Lancet on how you communicate with children about their own illness and that of their parents. So I thought I'd give you a very, I'm not going to go through all these slides in detail about why that's so important and what evidence is being produced to show how important, effective and high quality communication is for children for illness and death. And what we know is that if the quality is high and if it is effective, then it has massive implications for children's own psychological well-being and that of the family. As you can see here, for child illness, we know that in the cancer and the HIV literature, and so the cancer literature is very much in high-income countries, and the HIV literature is very much more in lower middle-income country research, is that we know that depression and anxiety is absolutely affected and is much lower in children where communication is effective. And if you don't tell children what's going on, they do have increases in emotional difficulties. And this is exactly the same if a parent has an illness. So as Louise said at the beginning, children are absolutely aware of what's going on. And if they're not told, they already know something is happening. So in this, this is a perfect example in this Chinese study where less than 40% of children knew their HIV status of their parents. But actually, in those that weren't told, 80% of them already knew that their parent was HIV positive. And again, these studies, the review that we produce shows that if you don't tell children that a parent has a life-threatening condition, then it affects again their psychological functioning. So depression and anxiety can be become higher in these children, and also they have increased behavioural problems. And again, it's all about the amount of information that they're given, and right at the very beginning when a parent is diagnosed with a disorder. So why is it so important now, this kind of research during COVID, especially with children? So Louise, and I hope you'll get from Louise's and I talk how passionate we are about this, and how children are so important, although they are not directly, well, although some children are affected, but it's predominantly an adult disorder. Children are completely affected by what's going on around them. So we know that patients, due to the way hospitals have to run now, although that is slightly changing, the healthcare professional has no idea about family setup anymore, which is very hard for the healthcare professionals themselves, and also for the families. So that just exacerbates how invisible these children are. And it goes beyond that immediate family group. So we're not talking just about parents or grandparents, we're also talking about those absolutely critical relationships adults may have as a godparent, as a neighbour, as anyone that has contact with children. We don't know as a healthcare professional how important that is to the children. And also, this is increased, of course, by the fact that most of these conversations are now happening over the telephone. So this means that families are then left, once they take that phone call, with that terrible issue of then telling their children that their loved one has died. When lockdown was even more than lockdown is at the moment, that meant that privacy and time was absolutely minuscule, because they have taken that phone call, they go downstairs, their children know what's happening, they ask. So the families then again are affected by, how am I going to convey this awful information? So what we've done in our group at Oxford is develop a platform of resources that are completely free for everybody. And what we did is that we made some step-by-step infographics and animations that were for healthcare professionals, care staff and school staff, in trying to go through that stepwise information of how you break this terrible news to a loved one. But was absolutely critical in this was identifying if that relative had any important relationships with children. And because of that, we then made, again, an infographic and animation specifically for families on how they're going to break that bad news to any of the children. So as you can see, this is what it basically looks like, and we go through it literally step by step, and also suggested phrases to use, so the parent feels, or the parent or the relative feels completely supported in trying to break this devastating news to any children. We're very lucky that we have lots of good collaborations around the world. So these have been cascaded with WHO and UNICEF and other networks within the UK. And we are lucky enough to have them translated into other languages. So I hope you can see that for what Louise and I have been trying to do over the last few months is just trying to make those impossible conversations possible. And if you can imagine, you are a parent who has just received a phone call to be told that your own parent has died, and then you have to walk down the stairs and tell your children, who are waiting for that phone call because they know that their grandma or their granddad has been very ill, and then you have to tell them this devastating news. And that is why we've produced these platform of resources, and why this is so important to us. The invisibility of children is just so important. Thank you.